Hi everyone, Andrew Phillips here from Google with a quick intro to application delivery, or AppCTL as you may have heard it called, which is about simplifying declarative continuous delivery for your custom applications. So what's the deal here? Well, this is initially and mainly about demonstrating, not just in slides, but actually in product form, how we can set up a recommended CD process or continuous delivery process for the custom applications that you develop. And so this handles topics such as, where do I put my Kubernetes YAML? How do I handle environment-specific differences? How should I process this YAML in my pipeline? How should I do approvals? Lots and lots of questions that we consistently get. There's a bunch of recommended tools that we would suggest you use, but combining these tools and getting all the steps right in order to do the end-to-end flow can be quite tricky. And so part of the tooling we're going to show today aims to make that a lot simpler and remove a lot of toil and a lot of potential friction. And of course, once you've walked through the steps of configuring and then also running an application deployment, you probably want to move on to doing that automatically as part of a continuous delivery flow. So everything that we're going to show today can also be done from an automated pipeline runner, such as Cloud Build or Jenkins or GitLab CI or those kind of things. We're mainly going to focus on a sample custom application, such as you would be building yourself with one of your own dev teams. But one of the really nice aspects of this is that we're going to use the same kind of machinery for managing applications in Kubernetes Engine that you can also use for your off-the-shelf applications that come, for example, from the marketplace. So things like backup, restore, that kind of cross-cutting operational management can all be done in a consistent way. What am I going to focus on today? Well, we're going to simulate, or we're going to go through what a developer or a platform team or DevOps or SRE or whatever you'd like to call them member would do in order to configure and exercise a continuous delivery progression for a given application. So that starts with setting up the various repositories and config structures for a GitOps style flow, including handling multiple target environments. And then we're going to actually walk through the steps to exercise the deployment to one of those target environments, which means processing YAML and generating it, approving it, and so on. And then we're going to touch on how that can be taken and put into an automated orchestration system, as I said, such as Cloud Build or Jenkins or GitLab CI or Tecton or whatever. And that will then turn into your automated CD progression using exactly the same systems and practices. So we're starting from a very simple setup. We've got an application repository. It's got a Docker file, so it is a containerized app. But that's it. There's no Kubernetes YAML yet, because that's one of the things people generally want to find out. How do I do this properly? And we have a test environment. We've got a cluster running in GKE in a particular GCP project, and that's one of the clusters we're going to use to target in our deployment. So the very first thing I need to do is I need to add some structure here. I need to add some Kubernetes configuration. I need to add some places to hold that configuration. And basically, I don't want to have to read a ton of blog posts to figure this out. I would like Google to take care of this for me. And indeed, that's what we're going to do with a command called appctl init. And so let's run that. So we can see what we have here. We've got a couple of repositories. I've already been doing a bunch of stuff, as you can see. My fourth app, that's the application repository I'm talking about. There's the Docker file. It's a very simple app, just a classic Hello World app. And what we're going to do now is we're going to set up, we're going to initialize rather a repository next to that to hold the Kubernetes configuration. It's also possible to use this setup by putting the Kubernetes configuration in the same repository. And I'll talk a little bit about why we, in this demo, we are focusing on the split in a second, but let's run these commands first. So I'm going to call it my fourth app config, because that's really what it will contain. I am going to point it at a remote repository, because of course I don't just want to have it here. I can either, so this is going to create a new repository for me by convention, app dev tester, and I'm going to call it, same name, my fourth app config. And then this could be done by default, but I'm just going to use a slightly different name for this. We support multiple repository styles with this tool, incidentally, not just GitHub. I'm going to call that my fourth app env. That's where the expanded YAML that is actually going to be deployed is going to go. We'll see a little bit what that means. And I'm going to exercise one of the other options. This is where I want the Kubernetes YAML to go. I'm going to put it in a directory called Kubernetes. And so now I'm running this in interactive mode from the command line. The tool knows this. If I'm running this from a CI/CD engine, nothing is prompted. But now it'll go ahead and create a bunch of repositories for me with an initial structure of a setup. So let's have a brief look on the command line what we have here. We now have this new repository, my fourth app config, and it already has a bunch of structure set up for me. And specifically, it has the Kubernetes directory, which this is using Kustomize, has a base folder, which is where we store the standard config. And then for our different environments, we store it elsewhere. It's not committed yet. This gives me a chance to make changes if I want to, but I'm not going to make any changes yet. And so I'm going to push this up to GitHub. And then I already have a couple of things pre-set up for me. So you'll notice that I've actually set up two repositories, if you remember from the prompts. Let's talk a little bit about where we're at now. So we have our application repository. That's where we started. We have a new config repository that's using a customized structure to handle the YAML that we're going to use to deploy our application. This is structured in such a way that we have very little duplication, so it's no expanded out files. And this allows SREs, platform teams, DevOps teams, developers, whoever is the appropriate owner for this code, to manipulate this config rather, to manipulate it in a human-readable and a human-friendly fashion. You can imagine different styles of abstraction here, potentially even language or framework-specific styles. So this is not meant to be the kind of close to the metal YAML. This is what teams and people need to interact with. In order to capture as an audit trail, as a restore point, as a GitOps style approach, what actually needs to be running in the cluster, we also have a deployment repository. And this will store the fully expanded Kubernetes YAML that is exactly what should be running inside your Kubernetes cluster. And this is not going to be abstracted or high level in any way. It's going to be very verbose and expanded and effectively the result of compiling the YAML, if you like. One of the reasons in this particular example we've decided to split out the application repository and the config repository is it generalizes quite nicely to a setup where you may have multiple containers, multiple Docker files, in other words, contributing to a certain application. And imagine you have different teams working on the individual services. They can still be deployed together as one unit with this app config repository. But it's also possible to merge those two. So in the limit case, if you like, where you have one application and one set of config, and the same people who own them, in other words, same development team, you can combine these two, and that gives the dev team one place to worry about. So great, we have a kind of initial setup here. Let's, that's the first thing we need to do. We don't have a target environment yet, so now we would usually need to go and configure one. And this may mean a whole bunch of things. It may mean installing some things in the cluster, adding namespaces, and so on and so forth. What it means in our case specifically is we need to update our configuration structure in order to handle a new environment. And again, this is multiple steps, multiple actions that need to be carried out in all the different repos that we have. And so we're going to simplify that for users. So we're going to say appctl env add, and we're going to call it test. Why not? And we're going to point it at a cluster called staging cluster. And we could obviously supply additional arguments like things like projects and namespaces. And we get some interesting warnings from our cluster here, but we're not going to worry about that right now. And so now, as we can see, if we were to look at the logs, is what we've done here, added scaffolding for a new environment test. And what this means specifically is that in the Kubernetes folder, if we look at that configuration, in the environments folder, we now have set up for a specific environment. And in that other repository, we now have a branch, a test branch that represents the fully expanded code for that particular target environment. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to push this up. The tool hasn't pushed it up yet. This gives me an opportunity to make changes that I want to, but I'm going to push it straight up. And now I have basically the definition of a test environment done in a single step, which is very nice. As far as my structure is concerned, as I said, the changes that have been made for me, I've gone and modified the customized structure to have a good place to put my test environment specific config, and I have a branch that will store the fully expanded configuration for that environment. That's great. But now we actually want to go ahead, and we may want to go ahead and deploy an application. So one of the things we haven't done in this particular setup, we haven't auto-generated Kubernetes YAML, for example. So we do need to get some from somewhere for this application. And as it so happens for a demo, I do have some. So I'm going to go into the base repository, and I'm going to copy from a little bit further up in the hierarchy. I'm going to take my demo YAML, and I'm going to copy it into here. And well, this is just very vanilla YAML for a particular application, so nothing special. It's a deployment, a config map, a service to expose it, so nothing amazing there. And one of the things about the deployment is, well, the image is what's going to be built, but this will be overridden, obviously, because I want to deploy a different version every time. I'm going to pull a background color from the config map. The version to be deployed is stored in the customization. So every time, as I'm building new versions of the application, new commit chars are generated. By updating this customization file, I will point at the correct version of the application to deploy. So let's have a look at what is the actual latest version. I've been working with this for a bit. Let's have a look at my 4th app. Let's look at the logs, update the welcome message for the demo. Well, let's choose a new welcome message. Why not? Let's have a look. This is going to say, oh, hello, a colleague of mine. Hello, demo video audience. Why not? That seems very generous. Let's add this code. Let's commit it. And we're going to call it update welcome message. Why not? And then we're going to push this up. Or we're going to push it if I specify the branch. Okay, great. So now we have a slightly updated version of my application. And this is the version that we're going to use. This is the commit char, the short char, obviously. We've set up a simple pipeline that will build a new container and tag it with that char. And so that means that one of the things we can do here is we can update our config YAML here to point at that particular version. That's what we want. Okay, great. And now I can add this. And I can commit it. And this is going to be add Kubernetes config for current version. Right. So now what I have my config repository with the actual config that I want to deploy in that particular setup. I am now going to add a tag. One of the best practices that we are espousing is that you should have a tag for everything that you deploy. I am going to say, well, actually no, I am going to say this is going to be this commit. That's what I'm going to be deploying. Great. And now I can push all these changes and the tag to master. There's a little, oh, that's meant to be master. So a lot of stuff happened here. So let me just take a quick step back. We haven't actually used appctl yet, but what we've done in this particular setup is we've actually added Kubernetes configuration for my application, and we have pointed it at a particular version of my container that I want to deploy. Then we've added a tag to say that this is a particular config version, if you like, that I really would like to deploy. And you'll see this tag come back in a second. Because now what we want to do is we want to get ready to deploy this particular tag to our test environment. And in order to do that, we will call appctl prepare. And we will say, please go ahead and prepare from this particular tag the YAML to be deployed. Of course, we should also add the environment that we're going to deploy to. And so, oh, no, that isn't quite correct. Oh, well, that's obviously true because I'm in the wrong directory. If I look at the error message, if I go back to the correct directory, then that's fine. I'm not using Semver for this. For production environments, I should be using Semver and so on. That's great. But now what's happening is I am taking this config, this repository rather, at this particular state, and I'm now going to say I am going to try to get an approval in order to deploy this into my testing environment. So, oh, that's the wrong. That clearly is not going to work. So let me copy this again. See whether I can paste it properly. No, that doesn't seem like it's going to work. So let's do this differently. So I'm now going to paste this. I have now automatically had a pull request created for me. So this is an approval flow. I am asking to add this fully expanded Kubernetes configuration to my test environment. And that is going to say, this is what the state I want my test environment to be in. The pull request has been prepared by appctl. I may or may not, so I'm now going to go ahead and merge and approve it. That's fine because I believe it. Of course, we could have all kinds of checks and permissions and effectively CI and linting and validation and so on set up for this. And of course, I don't necessarily need to have a pull request. If I want to deploy straight to that environment, I can skip the pull request generation phase in general. But now I have this merged into the test environment. And as a final step, all I need to do to actually deploy it is I can go appctl apply the test environment. And once again, in fact, I'll make it easy on myself. I'm just going to use this. What this will do is that will take the changes from the repo where they are stored into the actual target cluster. And again, I'm doing this step by step by hand interactively, obviously in an automated setup. Merging that change in would have caused the deployment to happen straight away. So while this is running, there we go, it's already finished. Let's briefly go back and have a look at what actually was going on there. So we ran prepare. As we saw, prepare went ahead and created a PR against the test branch. We then went and merged that in so that the changes were on the test branch. And then we ran apply, and apply's job is to get the app actually running in the target environment. Let's have a quick look at what that looks like. If we go into the Kubernetes Engines UI and we have a look at the applications page, we can see my fourth app config in a namespace that's been generated. This is the version that we've deployed that is basically based on the tags that I used. And this is the Kubernetes config that we're talking about here. And so we can see the various components of the application. We can see its version history. Lots of really nice and useful things. And again, going back to the bigger point, you can manage all your applications in this fashion, not just the ones that you deploy yourself, but also the ones that you're deploying from places like the marketplace. So, deep breath, lots of stuff that happened there. Let's briefly recap. So we went from a state where we had nothing set up, where we scaffolded or bootstrapped the configuration management, the repositories to store our GitOps style declarative flow. We defined a target environment, did that basically in 2 steps overall. We then, after adding some Kubernetes configuration for my application, we then prepared a deployment to the test environment, had that approved through a pull request, again, GitOps style model. And after having that pull request merged, we deployed the application into the test environment, and we saw it running in the GKE Application tab. Now, clearly, we don't necessarily every time we want to go ahead and prepare and deploy an application want to have to get a command line and type things out or do that from an IDE or any other interactive fashion. The goal of continuous delivery is to have this done in a fully automated fashion. And of course, one of the design goals and one of the ways appctl is built is that you can automate all the steps that we've just seen, the preparation and the application of your deployment in a fully automated fashion. So I'm not going to go through all the steps on how to set this up, but I'll just briefly explain the setup that we have here, and then I'll run through a couple of small changes and show you what that looks like. So in this particular setup, we have 3 target environments: test, staging, and production. And we have the following trigger conditions for each of those. So what happens is whenever you change your application code, it's going to build a new image and it's going to update the config repository automatically. That will in turn cause a deployment to the test environment. So basically you get the thing that most teams want. Whenever I change my code and the build passes, I'm going to automatically deploy to the testing environment. For the staging environment, staging deployments happen whenever you tag your config or your source code with a release candidate tag. So you add a tag to your repository. That tag in turn triggers a preparation and an application to the staging environment, not the test environment. And then if you decide that you're good with what's currently running in staging, or you're good with a previous version, you can add a production tag, in other words, not a release candidate tag. And that will in turn, when you then manually trigger a deployment, because we're going to do a manual deployment because that's what most people do for production still, that will in turn trigger an approval request and a deployment into the production environment. Well, let's see that in action. Okay. Let's go back here. We'll stop with my 4th application because that's the one that we've been using here. For this particular demo, we're going to use my 3rd app, which has basically the same setup, but is already pre-configured with a CI/CD system to make all these things work. So let's have a quick look at what we've got running here. We've got some versions of my application already running. You can see here's what's running in prod, here's what's running in staging, here's what's running in test. And obviously, let's have a look at what that looks like. Let's have a look at the various services and see what the app is actually showcasing right now. So this looks like it's going to be my test instance. This is going to be staging. Let's just click that again. This is going to be staging. And finally, it's going to be production. As you can already see, our staging environment has a different background color, just a classic demonstration of environment-specific differences. All right, very nice. So what we're now going to do, first things first, is we're going to demonstrate how a code change follows through this sequence and goes into production. So we're going to go into my code, and we're going to make a change. As you can see, this is what we're currently seeing. And we're going to change that to demo audience. And we're going to add this code change, and we're going to say update welcome message. What a surprise. And we're going to push this up to master. And now everything that we previously did by hand in a step-by-step approach happens entirely automatically. Let's have a little bit of a look at how this is wired up. So we have on the repository that we just committed a couple of triggers. The first one will build and push the image. So that's a classic CI loop, and we could run all kinds of tests in here, but for interest of speed, I'm not doing that. And once that is complete, we are then going to update the image to deploy in the testing environment. So we're going to say, please set the version to deploy to all the environments to this new version that has just been built. That is this particular trigger. And then, because we want to do automated deployments, we are going to automatically say, we are going to add a tag on that repo. That, in turn, will cause a deployment to the test environment, or rather, it will cause a request for approval, which will then turn into an actual deployment. Let's see what's running right now. So as we can see, we've had the build and push has finished. Now we are running, we're updating the environment, or we're updating the settings of the version to deploy. And once that is complete, we will get a pull request, which is asking us to deploy this particular version that has just been built into the testing environment. Let's have a quick look at the repositories that are involved here. So let's have a look at which version we currently have that we're going to deploy. So we can see this is still the old one that was committed 7 days ago, but what is going to happen in a second is we're going to see a request to deploy a new version of the application to our testing environment. So let's follow this build briefly. This is automatically running the prepare step that we were talking about, or that we ran on the command line. And you can see it is going to prepare for the testing environment, the version that has just been built. And that in turn is going to give us a pull request that we need to approve. Then we will then that will be applied to the environment automatically. So as you can see, we're just doing all the work with the Git repos that is necessary, all the tagging, all the low-level manipulation that you really don't want to do yourself. And we have a link to the pull request that requires approval straight away. So you can see there's already an app running where, in fact, the pull request gives you pretty nice information about what exactly is being changed. And in fact, it's a very simple change right now. We're just going from one version of the application to the other. That's as we would expect. We're going to skip through the merge process very quickly. And this, in turn, as I kind of hinted at earlier, kicks off another automated pipeline, which causes that particular change to actually be applied to the testing environment. And so we will see the new background message, or the new message rather, show up here in a second. And if we go over into the applications page, we will also see in the test environment a new version of the application will show up here in a second as well and be deployed. Let's briefly go back to the build history to see what's going on. Yeah, so there we can see the pipeline that's running that is actually causing this change to happen in the testing environment. It's already complete. With that, well, it's still coming up, so let's give it a second. And we can see my third app in the testing environment. That is indeed the new version that we are expecting. And with a quick refresh, here's hello demo audience as we just added. And with that, given the time, I'm going to stop. I think you can imagine how this continues For the different environments, it's just different triggers. They cause different pipelines to run, but they always run the same sequence of commands: prepare, apply. It's very simple to set up, simple to maintain, and runs really nicely with lots of good practices at the back. Thank you very much.